Thanks everybody for joining us for today's webinar, which is looking at learning that we can, in Scotland, gain from research carried out in England regarding the experiences of black and mixed heritage boys and girls within the justice system in England. We will be hearing from John Wainwright, who is a doctor within the University of Lancashire, where he teaches on a variety of different courses relating to youth culture, social work, and youth justice. John will very shortly be taking us through a number of slides relating to research that he's undertaken, and I think it's at the end we'll be able to take any questions and comments from people via the chat function, so please feel free to use that. The slides from today will also be sent out at a later date, and a recording will be posted on the CYCJ website and sent out to people who have registered for it. In terms of this topic, I think it's a really pertinent one, as always, across the UK, particularly given some of the events that we've seen over the last couple of years. And whilst within Scotland, we seem to have the impression that this is particularly acute with England, that it's certainly not been issues that have escaped Scotland, and as we've seen over the last few months, and as high-profile issues within Scotland have been raised over the last few years, issues about race, ethnicity, and the way that we respond to people who come into conflict with law from minoritized groups is certainly an area that needs further attention, and practitioners certainly need to know exactly how best to do their job. So that subject area is definitely one that needs to be considered more fully, and we reached out to John, given some of his writings that we have used within the CYCJ practice guide, which we'll be dropping the link to in the chat very shortly. So for practitioners, we probably suggest and we encourage you to have a look at that, particularly when you're thinking about working with people from the range of diverse groups that we come into conflict with law. So with no further ado, I'll pass you over to John, who will take us through the remainder of the presentation. And as I said, please do ask any questions and summarise any comments that you may have within the chat. Over to you, John, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Ross. Appreciate it being invited to talk to you all up here. It's nice to join you, and nice to see that in some parts of the world, the sun's actually shining. I'm actually talking from Liverpool, and it's not shining. Although, as you can see from my quaint background, I actually work in the University of Lancashire up in Preston, up the road here. So thanks, Ross. So just before I talk about the study and some ideas, which I'd like to engage with you, just a bit, I notice a lot of you are practitioners or whatnot. I always just think about just grounding myself. So my name's John Wainwright. I, for many years before coming into the academy, into higher education, I was an AL social worker, a youth justice worker, working mainly in Liverpool 8 here, which is Toxteth and Old Money. And also through lived experience, I did a lot of work with a lot of colleagues and children, young people who will now be adults, of course, through Black and in Care, and those who are close to these issues understands that there's a strong link between the experiences of children and young people in care and the criminal justice system, and the extra twist of race or racism also adds to some of the problematics around the experiences of Black children in care. So that's me. So nice to meet you all. So today I'm going to talk about a co-creative learning project that myself and colleagues undertook over between 2022 and 2023, 18 months, I think it was. And it's a proper football team or hockey team or whatever your sport is there. And the money is actually got from the woman at the end of that list, somebody called Professor Cathalakis now, actually, and she's Professor. But I put myself and Darren and Nora at the front of this part of the project because it's the thinking that we've developed while working with these children, these Black mixed heritage African children, that informed the first part of this talk. And thereafter, I'm also going to talk to you about some ideas that I've been developing around working with Black and mixed heritage children, also Black space making. So I'd value your opinions really on it. So as you can see there, the title is Co-Creating Learning and Change with Black and mixed heritage boys and girls in contested places and Black space making. Rather catchy title, I think you'll notice, yeah? Trips off the tongue. I do this now. Sorry, this thing here, that's gone right. I do this now, as you can see, I've put that on properly, just to talk, just to advertise. And it talks to my lived experience, also talks to other academics' lived experience. And we've set up a research centre in the University of Lancashire through rebellion and pushing back, really. We've set up a research centre run by academics of colour for communities of colour, brown, black, dual heritage. And of course, there are Eastern Europeans or whatever. So it's through migrants. And Ross made reference to the struggles that the migrants have got at the moment. So in terms of getting out of bed, the reason we do any of this work is so that we can actually hopefully work alongside and co-create, co-tell the stories of our communities, many and diverse, heterogeneous communities of color, to make maybe just a little tiny bit their lives a bit better. But all of us understand how privileged we are. In fact, I just digress again. I'm always minded as a boys' social worker when Ambalavana Sivanandan spoke to us all in a Black Social Workers Project many thousand years ago. He said, "Don't you think anything special? Actually, you come from the communities. It's the community struggle that put you there." So that's where our intellectual and political positioning comes from. And if you're interested in, check us out, Global Race Centre for Equality. Besides me, there's some rather fetching people there. I think you'll agree. Okay. So the presentation will be as follows. So we'll talk about the Black and mixed heritage peer researchers, place, spaces, and belonging. Some of the stuff, for those of you who are academics, you'll be familiar with, but I just want to try and put it within the experiences of Black children, really. The post-colonial, critical race theory, and then moving on to Black space making, if I may. And then I've prepared some stuff to say to you. Experiencing serious violence can be life-altering for children, young people, and their families and communities. Preventing children, young people becoming, and this talks to the project, of course, that we're talking about, the Peer Action Collective project. Young people becoming involved in violence involves us understanding their experiences and building evidence about what works so that appropriate and effective action can be taken. However, all too often, young people experience violence and are not part of this conversation. So as we know through our practice and through our studies, often those who are on the receiving end of violence are not part of this conversation. So, and this was set up by the Youth Endowment Foundation. They're funding loads of projects at the moment regarding youth violence across the country, in England and Wales. I'll look at Ross in Scotland too? Question mark. Nod. No. Yeah. But the Peer Action Collective was a project we were involved in, and it existed to support moves towards enabling young people to be active part of the research and change. So the Peer Action Collective was a unique opportunity to engage young people in building evidence, not just of what works, but also why things work and how they work. And so the findings of this study are presented in this report, offer an in-depth and unique insight into how violence affects young people across England and Wales, and shares ideas and learning that young people themselves have developed to help reduce violence and improve safety in their communities. The Peer Action Collective trained young people in research, in peer research, and supported them to create, excuse me, I had some Coke before, sorry, so if it repeats on me, to carry out high quality qualitative research, to analyse findings to inform the design of the research projects, and also to move on to work with children, young people, to set up social action projects. So in a nutshell, you've got Youth Endowment Foundation funding organisations to work with children, young people to set up a peer action collective. They'd learn to co-create research. Once that research and the themes have been developed, they would then go out and work with a broad range of children, young people to set up social action projects, whatever they may be. Okay. So I want to start with blackness and end with blackness, really, because there's many things to many people. So this study engages with a postmodernist and non-essentialist reconceptions of notions of identity, as opposed to the unified subject traditionally favored in positivist imperialist studies. It considers how blackness has been historically constructed and objectified as a silent and imagined other, and we'll come back to the other, to whiteness, other to whiteness, and invites a rethinking of the ways black male biographies are read and of the social basis of their definition. The idea of blackness in this study refers to the political, cultural, and social ways of being and seeing members of the black diaspora and seeing by members of the black diaspora. The study understands blackness as being non-essentialist, fractured, and disrupts claims to authenticity, arguing instead that black identities and blackness are multifaceted and needs to be examined as such. So in other words, it's intersectional and fluid. Failure to debunk this reading would render our understanding of black identities, black experiences, and black social knowledge as fixed, narrowed, and ultimately constraining. One of my favorite theorists, in fact, and one of Darren's favorite theorists as well, the other black fella on this project, Darren, uh, was Bell Hooks, and she argues that anti-essentialist critique allows us to affirm multiple black identities and a varied black experience. Thus, blackness not only constitutes a moral, symbolic, and imaginary space, but encompasses performative formations by which contemporary black men construct and understand themselves as both being male and black. To articulate black masculinity is therefore a process of becoming performance repetitions. There is no essential core natural to us. Okay. And when I first did this presentation, it was 75, I think 76 years now, so forgive me, but it talks to all your experiences up in Scotland regarding migrants and blackness, talks to much to our experiences down in England and Wales as well. Now, I remember many years ago presenting to a bunch of black youth workers in London, funny enough. And I said, there's something, you always got to have a few figures in it. You might not understand the figures, but you have figures, people say, wow, you got figures, positivist. Um, so, so I just want to show really in these figures the depth of the study. So yeah, Youth Endowment Foundation wanted us to work with a minimum 120 children across the program providers between 16 and 25 and young people. And can you see that? I'm struggling to see it, if I'm honest, but it shows.
Yeah, we can, John. Yeah.
Thank you, Ross. It shows these are 6 quarters, 3 months. The amount of white children that we worked with, black, mixed, and so on. I'm struggling to read the words, and also then cumulative of black and minority ethnic, so on and so forth. The point is just to understand that the breadth of the project, really. So this was an being black members adds another dimension. So this was an ecosystem for the funding by EF, and they wanted us to recruit 20% of young people who were black. I just said that. Yeah, I don't want anything else at the moment. Yeah. But these numbers you see in front of you refer to the entirety of the programme in England and Wales. And we ran them in 10 distinct areas. So, for example, we ran them there's one down in Cardiff, one over here in Liverpool, one across in the northeastern Sunderland, London, Birmingham, and so on, to reflect the demographic distributions in England and Wales, and also to try to capture the different experiences in places and spaces that black, white, and mixed children experienced through violence, in violence across the country. But as I say, 20% of the peer researchers were identified as black, and 40% were from black and minority ethnic groups. Okay. Again, don't get too hung up, because I don't. But again, if you can just see the ethnic distribution, I can read this, so this better this time. So you can see the research participants, how many had one-off involvement over each of the 3-month periods. That makes sense. So just to make it simple, in the first quarter across the 10 sites, 13 black children or young people. The second quarter, 24 black children, young people. 36 mixed children, young people. Fourth quarter, 48 children, young people. If you like figures, we'll send them out. You can pore over them all day. But the challenge was to make sure that this youth violence project was as broad as possible. We had to have contact with 4,800 children across the whole site, across the whole project. The project, by the way, was 18 months. The findings of the peer research project led to the design of social action projects to achieve social change in their local areas. The young people working on social action were the change makers. So again, simple bloke that I am, you've got peer action collective in the 10 sites across England and Wales, and then once the findings from the social action project from the peer action collective had taken place, the social action projects would try to be set up to work with change makers to change something. So, for example, in Liverpool, that we had a knife project, for example. I think that we also had one over in Birmingham as well, if that makes sense. And the number of change makers involved were between 10 and 17%. So what I'm trying to get to you through all these figures is that we started off with a small funnel of peer action researchers across the 10 sites. And from their findings, we worked on social action projects with a larger body of change makers across the 10 sites. And these figures, in essence, show the distribution of ethnicity across these sites. And then the point to take here really is that the two things really. One is that the most of the children, black children that took part in these projects were in London, Lambeth, and in Birmingham. And the other important point to make is, interestingly, the majority of black children were of African heritage, African, rather than British-born blacks, which is interesting as and of itself. And there we go again, further breakdown. I'm not going to, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. So that I can assure you now, I won't talk to you any more about figures. You'll be glad to know. But if you are interested, actually, in in essence, in a nutshell, what we're trying to say is we spoke to a shed load. We worked with a shed load of children, young people in the peer action collective across the 10 sites, and then even a wider mushroom, a wider, broader funnel of children, young people, white, black, and mixed heritage across the 10 sites to do the social action projects and turn them into change makers. I always use this slide. It resonates with me. It goes back to GRACE, the Global Race Centre for Equality, and how privileged we are, those of us of colour, in professional jobs, and then the experiences of communities and the experiences of black and mixed heritage, and indeed white children through social class as well. And it resonates. There is racism that discriminates, yeah, and there's racism that kills. And again, Ross made, implicitly made comment to that, and it's troubling me on a number of, as much as the experiences of our own children, our own community's children, in terms of violence, troubles me very much, or the violence they experience. It troubles me, this raise the flag nonsense is starting to take place in terms of whiteness being in and blackness being out. And again, it talks Sivanand, a sage philosopher and political writer all those years ago. But in the context of this, we're thinking about children here. Okay, so there's a picture of South London. So first of all, we're going to just talk about the projects in the London Peer Action Collective. So just to talk about the research questions and methods, you can see that, read the stuff. So the London Peer Action Collective chose to focus on the impact of young people's environments, specifically living on or around social housing estates, on youth violence. London PAC conducted 138 individual interviews and created workshops in schools with a further 200 and workshops in schools with a further 231. The findings were extensive, and the key insights stood out. For young people in Lambeth, and don't forget, I don't know if I mentioned it, but the vast majority of children in the London Peer Action Collective, the High Trees Peer Action Collective, were black, either black or British black or mixed heritage. For the young people in Lambeth, violence was seen as an inevitable experience, normal part of their life, indicating high levels of desensitization and a sense of hopelessness. The research identified how poor housing conditions on and around states made young people unsafe, and heightened experience of youth violence. Many young people in the research felt unprotected and unsupported by public services such as police, school, and describing both institutions as making them feel alienated and unsafe. They described feeling cut off from important opportunities due to a number of factors, including safety when moving through the area and discriminated due to their background. The research found that there was there was a lack of safe, affordable, and youth-friendly spaces, which are important for young people to find connection. And we know that Osborne, in his austerity, that coalition government ripped out youth services across the UK. Peer researchers also found that there is mental and emotional burden in living in these precarious and violent spaces, and the need for themselves to carry weapons to keep themselves safe and avoid harm. And these decisions, these precarious decisions, could end up in fatal consequences in terms of injury and or worse. Many young people felt that they didn't have control over their lives and futures, and often they felt that they did not have many options. So that was the findings from the Peer Action Collective. If I just read a simple bloke, Peer Action Collective did the peer thing, and the social action moved on to how they work with a wider group of people. So London Peer Action Collective concluded that experiences shared by young people across the findings, underpinned by structural inequalities and systemic failings, drove peer researchers towards wanting to create long-term, impactful change that would challenge these systems and respond to the issues in research. Peer researchers identified three key areas as the sites for greatest impact. These were lack of housing, and this is, Kel's surprise, really. Kel, how many years have you been in youth justice or working with children? Lack of housing, education, and lack of youth services were the three key areas. Excuse my clumsy use of the cursor as I move across. In due course, we'll talk about the violence of Black and mixed heritage children, their own experience, but just again to be aware that through all this study and other studies, we understand that the personal relations that lead to extrafamiliar harm are also layered and webbed with the multi-generational trauma of racism the parents, the Black mixed heritage African parents experience and sometimes project onto their children, and it shouldn't be underestimated. I'm going to talk to this in the future as well. And this talks to, and I know people, the generation of slavery, of colonialism, post-colonialism, and exclusion from these spaces. I'm not taking away culpability of violent behavior, but just an understanding of the structural exclusion that's taken place for parents, families, Black and mixed heritage children. Nice picture of West Midlands. So this is the other project we're focusing on. So the two main projects we're focusing on were Lambeth down in London and Birmingham Youth Services. And they focus because of the predominant amount of Black and mixed heritage children in these projects. Birmingham Youth Services PAC focused on their research on determining the causes and drivers of youth violence, and asked what deters young people from becoming involved in youth violence, seeking to answer the following question: what is it that children, young people experience that influence them to become involved in youth violence or violence on children? Birmingham Youth Service aimed to use this research to identify supportive models of prevention that could replicate to further prevent becoming involved in youth violence. They engaged 208 young people, 11 to 25, through a combination of individual interviews and small focus groups. The findings were The violence on young people was driven but through social relationships, including peer pressure. Again, this is not surprising. We know this in many other studies. Coercive behavior, often adults insisting they join gangs or, or get involved in behavior, as well as familial relationships and home environments. Additionally, Birmingham Youth Services noted the importance of failing support systems, particularly school exclusions. Again, we know this from our own research, our own practice. Describes research as a poor response to students, struggling students, pushing them towards a negative path. Young people felt that there was a lack of positive role models across the social, family, school settings, which were felt as a negative factor. Do I want to say anything else here now? So that was a peer research, and then Birmingham Youth Service focused on their social action on positive community relations, awareness, education, and support in response to the lack of positive role models young people in school experience in schools and in the communities. So again, the important thing really is that these two projects where the majority of children were Black or mixed heritage, these are what they came up with. And I appreciate that often the findings are not different, but they still resonate with how the young people experience their lives. Then we want to gangs and youth violence at the moment. I'm conscious if you're familiar with some of this literature for Black children, Black young people, the Patrick Williams and Becky Clark down the road here in Manchester are critical of the label of Black gangs and youth violence. But others like John Pitts and Suzella Palmer and others talk about the existence of gangs. Either which way, there are groups of young people that put young people in a precarious world. Those of you in the academy will be familiar with critical race theory and its strengths and areas perhaps where it's a little wooden. Those of you who are not in higher education but may not. What it does usefully is talks about the structural, poor housing, violence, education, lack of youth services for Black children. That's why I often use it as a lens, moving on, thinking about these two projects. Likewise, the post-colonial, I'm looking at the time, Ross. I'm just telling you that really. I don't know why. I'm just go back in 20 minutes, have I?
Take as long as you need. We'll get through as many questions as we can. So just
okay. Thanks, Ross. Okay. And likewise, the post-colonial. So thinking about those children and the findings that they came up with the peer collective, and then the social action project they wanted to do. Post-colonial theorists like Frantz Fanon, Stuart Hall, Spivak, and Barber, they invite us to understand Black and indeed Asian communities and mixed heritage communities as part of a post-colonial world. Well, and I've touched on it before, where whilst it's not immediately apparent, as people of color, we're post-slavery, post-transatlantic, we're now framed as displaced and unwanted in our major cities in England and Wales, and indeed, increasingly, you come back to me in the major cities in Scotland. Indeed, if you could argue, and well, the evidence also stacks up if you're interested in experiences of African American and also Black and migrant children in France and Germany as well, and other parts of Italy. They are on the outskirts, the margins of society, both economically and psychosocially. And so these are the contested terrains. The Black mixed heritage children have to negotiate in terms of trying to make spaces for themselves, and this shouldn't be minimized really. The spaces that often our Black children live in and negotiate on a day-to-day basis are on the margins, either physically and or psychosocially. And Bell Hooks summed this up in a book years ago, talking about black women. She talked about, again, if there's anybody there here with the nose hooks, she talked about from the margin to the centre, how important it was for black women, you think of black girls, to move from the margin of society, psychosocially, but also physically to the centre. So the experiences of black and mixed heritage boys. So we're just moving on now. We talked about the two projects. We talked about critical race theory. Talked about how post-colonialism as a lens can make us understand the experiences of black and mixed heritage boys reflect the urban geographies of structural and economic patterns of disadvantage afflicting contemporary cities. And their historical development. Thus, the places and spaces that black and mixed heritage boys and girls negotiate in their communities are economically, socially and culturally marginalised from large parts of their city. The marginalisation is evidenced by multiple deprivations. The children have identified that again in the projects. Inadequate lack of social service response, education, and we talked about an absence of youth interventions. And this is compounded by the everyday experiences of forms of racism, the subsequent trauma. And there's a great study by Harries in 2014 in Manchester, where a lot of black children experienced racism, and they went around negotiating the racism by denying it. But whether they may deny it or not, it's a thing. Importantly, there is often limited or no mainstream economic employment for opportunities for black and mixed heritage children that we talk to. And this is compounded by lack of opportunity to develop social capital skills. So the soft stuff that all the posh people can develop. The black and mixed heritage, and indeed white children, are often critically excluded from to engage in formal and rewarding employment opportunities. So black and mixed heritage boys with limited opportunities for other activities, except being pulled into offending behaviour, often end up being pulled into this kind of behaviour because of the limited opportunity. This is not negating or mitigating. It's just trying to explain the context of the children in Lambeth, the children in Birmingham. So selling drugs, use of serious violence or repeat violence, at times now the use of weapons as well, guns, as victims and perpetrators, alas now is often too common, as the children talk to. And this leads to, I would suggest, precarious cultural and psychosocial experience for these children, in contrast to tangible social, cultural, and educational employment. And so some quotes from the children. So one of the black boys from Lambeth, London, people are desensitized to violence in their communities. And this quote talks to, obviously, London, but can talk to many other cities. Works are done in Liverpool and Preston in particular, and indeed Manchester in particular. And the spaces, the precarious spaces, and I've talked about it already. Palmer, Pitts, and recently Bateman et al. Talk about this violence, the being pulled into gangs, being pulled into precarious ways of negotiating what are very violent settings for these children, as Stephen Case has pointed out, and provide recent compelling evidence that the violence that black and mixed heritage and indeed white children negotiate on a daily basis. As I say, not least being coerced or tempted into joining gangs. Davis and Marsh have also talked about the process of adultification. Get the words out, John. Where black children and mixed heritage children feel that they are treated as adults because they appear bigger, even though they are children. And these are the challenges that black children face. So with this structural, psychosocial, and physical environment, no wonder often children, black children, mixed heritage children, think, well, how can I make money quicker? Because it ain't going to come through the formal education system or employment or schooling. You may disagree, you may come back to me. Another quote from a peer researcher in Birmingham. No, I'm open about violence because I was part of that myself back in the days, but I'm not really into it now. Yeah, spaces by Black and mixed heritage children are entered into and negotiated with an element of trepidation, with the possibility of escalating violence. As I said, using guns and knives. Um, and these places are contested with their peers through groups or gangs. Um, and I've said before, the knives is often a necessity for self-defense when these children now, our children have to negotiate these spaces. I noted that the HMIP report for Black children, Black boys and Black and mixed heritage boys across, I think it was 10 or 12 youth justice sites in England and Wales. One of the children just described their experiences of living in a war zone, a war zone. Such was the contestation of having to negotiate through their peers. You can read that. So from a peer action collective to social action, there maybe is possibility to layer this to encourage the post-colonial, the excluded children, the excluded to have a counter voice, a world where their experience of being othered from schooling, from education, from mainstream society can actually be turned into a positive. And yeah, as this peer researcher suggested, yeah, they did very good social action, I think. Young people researching racism has done very beautiful things with this bit. So yeah, it's like them. I like everyone actually in peer research. Yeah. This black girl in London makes a connection between her peers' experience of violence and exclusion of that of racism, be that structural or in the post-colonial sense. Either way, they understand that this is a reason for their experience precarious and contested environment. And most importantly, if we enable our children to have the confidence, tools, self-belief, there is, I think, even though it's a structural, possibilities for change. Okay, if I should just go on to black space making, really, just to black space making. Um, and in many ways, these ideas come partly from the Peer Action Collective, partly from working with the Black and Care all these years ago, and I've worked with Black colleagues in educational setting and the mental health setting. And I'm not a separatist in the sense, but I do think there's a time and place for children, mixed heritage, Black heritage, to have space to feel safe and proud of who they are. And some of these ideas are not new, and they've been promoted over the centuries, really, by Black scholars. So, and Black scholars have said, look, if you keep your eyes on Black children in our cities now, and migrants. So we've been moved. In terms of transatlantic slavery, in terms of indenture, the likes of Oliver C. Cox, a Marxist Black historian, Frantz Fanon, Du Bois, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, amongst many others, have talked about creating a Black space where children, adults, communities feel actually nourished and proud and grow in a psychosocial but also in a political sense. And this talks as much to England, Wales, Scotland, the States, Europe, wherever there's been a displacement where Black children, mixed heritage children are on the margins of society, but pathologized and blamed. It's literally turning the idea of youth justice on its head, I think. And so instead of the trauma of well, it's not denial of the trauma of the violence that been inflicted on the Black diaspora, the African diaspora for centuries. It's about turning that round into something more positive, to try to develop some idea with Black children of their possibility of citizenship. And I ain't naive. I understand, right, that we're talking about some bad characters. We're talking about older adults who coerce into violence, into gangs, in terms of, but there's got to be another way. So we need to take a step back and think of a counterpoint, an alternative that does not portray Black children as all negative things. angry, disengaged, and violent. Rather, Black space making must be a co-creative space where understanding of the philosophy of Africanness is altogether different and a celebratory thing. There needs to be a movement for Black and mixed heritage boys to understand, to be able to articulate their democratic voice. Black and mixed heritage boys are those that are often silenced, except when talking about violence and pathologized. So co-creating, in the sense, building on what we've done in the Peer Action Collective and Social Action Collective, provides a space, a counter-narrative for Africanness, for Blackness as a legitimate hearing, rather than something that's negative. And there are, at the moment, I mean, to be fair, there are projects around the country. I know they're doing this, but there's nothing coherent. I don't hear a common vision. I don't hear a common vision. These spaces need to be of African heritage, and those that are the mentors need to experience these precarious lives, but also be Black, whatever that means, in the multifaceted we talked at the beginning, both in body and mind, as Frantz Fanon says. So it's about a liberatory experience, trying to create a space that liberates our children from the feeling of everything being negative, rather than rather than everything. Black practitioners, community workers, community champions need to co-design with our children spaces that are safe, that where Africanness is a virtue. I get community champions, by the way, for those of you, because some of you may be in children and families teams that talk. There's a Black adoption project down in London that've come up with the idea of community champions for the very same thing in this context, around championing the strength of the Black families in our own communities to build and support our Black children in care. Mentors, by any other word, mentors with credibility. So Blackness in children, adults, and families within our heterogeneous and ever-changing communities. It provides an opportunity for a narrative that moves away from silencing our children to experiences that are heard and that are celebrated. And you may think this is, I'm conscious of this, you may think this is all, do you know what I mean? Well, the other stuff ain't worked. Do you know what I mean? The other stuff ain't worked. And all that I say here, both based on the research at the beginning and the structural realities of children of Black mixed heritage across the country, says that there needs to be a radical rethink of the way we provide spaces. So if you get what I mean, Black space making is in our mind the psychosocial, but it's the cultural, spiritual, philosophical, emotional, and in the physical space in our communities. It's a radical rethink, and as I say, these come from Du Bois and Fanon and Hooks and many other philosophers. So certainly, blackness or Africanness can mean many things to many people. I said that at the beginning, to create a space where Black children can think about, and they do philosophize. They do, you know what I mean? Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? The politics, the culture that acknowledges our children's heterogeneous and multidimensional views of Blackness. A plurality of expressions, articulations, and creations of a Black identity. The important thing is that the space is safe, that they are loved. Our children are loved. Martin Luther King wrote Strength to Love many years ago, that we love our children. They feel important. Instead of focusing solely on the negative. And I put this in slightly facetiously, but also just partly whatever, really. So, instead of focusing on strength and difficulties questionnaires and risk assessments and all that, there's actually Sean Creaney's talked about how some of this can be just so soul destroying and just performative. So why not encourage poetry, drawing, music, argument, discussion, humor, whatever? And obviously, ultimately, we need an economic model for our children. But first of all, we need to provide spaces that are safe and loved to liberate their minds. And this is an example of High Trees, the Lambeth project, and what they produced. You can read the words, and we talked about it before, really, what they've come up with. Housing, education opportunities, listen to peers about the outcome research, ambitious but achievable demands to young people in their community based on peer research. And what I'm trying to do with this peer research is layer on Black space making, if you get what I mean. If you get what I mean. If you don't, well, there you go. And so, in other words, Black space making through co-creation is an environment where there provides a genesis of hope, an exploration and opportunities of Black and mixed heritage children. Encourages children, visitors, what this space making may be. That space can be in the minds of Black mixed heritage children. It can be physical or a building. I think I will leave it there. Is there anything I want to say that I can talk on? You get the gist. Um, a space where Blackness and Africanness are celebrated. Okay. Um, Thank you for listening and for the good times. That's me.
Thank you very much, John, for a really engaging webinar, right in the middle of Black History Month. So it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on Black History Month in itself. Just some comments from myself. We've got a couple, and we'll be expecting more questions from everybody in the chat. So please do stick them in there. I just think, as you're talking there about how children, Black children particularly, getting drawn into the youth justice system, and I'm just posing the question to you about how can we expect children, Black children, minoritized children, to feel part of society when there are more professors in the UK called John than there are Black professors? When we look at Parliament, who are predominantly white, when we look at social work departments, where those are in senior positions are predominantly white, you know, are we expecting children to comply, cooperate with what white people or those in power expect them to act? Yet at the same time, we're not really, we white people, those in power, are not really creating the society which Black children might feel that they can legitimately be part of.
I think that's a
So
really
I'll
good question.
pose that
Sorry.
question, and other people, please do jump in with the questions in the chat. And John, I'll let you answer that.
Sorry to talk across you, Ross. I think it's a really good question, and I suppose just briefly refer back to Sivanandan and Global Race Centre. Absolutely, absolutely. So the idea of Africanness or whatever, and somebody called Chijioke Bassy's written a lot about other people and Black space making it is to actually turn it on its head and say, well, yeah, this is where we are. What can we do? It's not to say we want to be, a Black judge or a Black head of social services departments or professor or whatever. Because in many ways, it's on one level, it's all make believe, isn't it? It's all, we all appoint each other and whatnot. And the academy, so I think it's a really good question. I mean, you can take it further. Well, how can Black children so damaged and traumatized by racism and their environment, change their trajectory? And I ain't saying it's easy. Particularly when bluntly there are some violent characters floating around who are older who are coercing them into this behavior. It ain't easy. It's about radically re-envisaging with them, with our own children, a different way of being, a different way of being. And I'm not saying it's a panacea for everything. Um, because as you're right, Ross, whiteness excludes. So even forgetting all the transatlantic stuff, whiteness excludes. But there's got to be another way. So I haven't got, I'm not. It's not the panacea for everything, but
Thanks for your point response to that, Peter. Okay, I'm going to hit you with a comment first of all from Sarah, who is going to drop a link into the chat about some work that she's done at the No Nice Better Life. She's reflecting back that what she's hearing from you really resonates with what she's heard through a different project that she's been involved in, where young people were told them, speaking about their experiences of crime, and they said that youth groups were really the safe spaces for them. Schools didn't feel that way. And one of the reasons they felt safer is because of the environment they had, and being accepted and understood by peers. So I suppose I pose the question, John, did that come out of the research that you were undertaking as well? And the big question that Stuart has asked here is, if there was one change you wanted to see, one that can make the most significant difference to that trajectory that you've talked about, what would that be? And how do we collectively re-envisage that? How do we make that happen?
so that's a
Nice wee
really
easy questions for you.
yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, because these are philosophical questions, aren't they? Really? I mean, so just in terms of you, yeah, you it can be use spaces, can be, it can be. It can be youth spaces. I mean, I think I don't, don't want to limit you because a lot of this is going on our heads. You know what I mean? Like, if I experience racism, back to civil, I'm now a middle class fellow or whatever. You know what I mean? If every day I experience it, if I've got nothing, I'm a 15-year-old child and dealing with all kind of nonsense, being stopped and searched and having to negotiate with my peers around territory and violence and spaces. So you know what chance have I got? So it's more than a physical space. It's more than a physical space. It's a philosophical, and people are philosophical, but our own children are, from this quotes are as philosophical as we are. They know what they want, and they know, you know what I mean. And it tends to be the material, of course it does. But there's another way. What I wanted, if there's one change, if there's one change. I'd like to, I think we need to create a space of Africanness for our children. I mean, Africanness in the diaspora sense that negotiates with the criminal justice system. Do you know what I mean? That just turns it on its head. That it turns on its head rather than, going into the diversion and prevention teams and do you know what I mean? And strength and difficulties and assessment, risk assessments. Does that tangibly make sense? So rather than saying, I'd like to see black schools, of course, black schools are important. Of course they are. And people have done fantastic. We've done fantastic work here. But there needs to be.
That makes sense, John. Thank you. We've got two more questions that come in, and I want to get to them. Before I do that, my very amazing colleague Sally is going to drop a link in the chat, and within that, you'll be able to see the forthcoming CYCG webinars, including one about exploring the age of criminal responsibility in Scotland and how do we currently respond to those children who, above the age of criminal responsibility, who cause harm. We've also got one a couple of weeks later regarding the experiences of children with ASD with insecure care. And we've got one just before Christmas also about child age of criminal responsibility and exploring the impact of COVID-19 or rather the impact of our response to COVID-19 upon children's development and pondering the question of whether or not that should be taken into consideration when it comes to responsibility and criminal responsibility. So please do consider coming along to them. Okay, John, back to the questions we got for you. Lots of people thanking you in the chat for the excellent presentation. The question from Francesca, which ties in with your previous response there. Any thoughts on how we can change the culture in social work so that Black children and their families are supported rather than being harmed when they interact with statutory services? What do radical safeguarding approaches look like to you?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, being an old social worker, I'm quite, I actually, most practitioners are all right, and they're trying to do their best in straitened circumstances. So I think the change can only come when if because I think most people are, most are doing their best. They might not be spot on with anti-racism, whatever, and understanding, but they're doing their best within a legal and policy framework that really manages and coerces really. What was the question? How can
how can we best support Black children and their families to feel supported rather than harmed by the iatrogenic harm that takes place when social worker comes and chaps your door?
Okay, so I think it's back engaging with the communities, local communities in our heterogeneous sense, and the community champions thing. And it's difficult, it's hard, because hard work, because some of the communities are angry and disengaged or whatever, but they engage with the communities, and often we're not going to want to hear what our local communities are saying, but we got to, there's like there's a disconnect in universities, disconnect with social work provision. So anti-racist training is all fine and dandy, and other trainings, but trouble is it goes in one ear and out the next, in my view. It's more about critically engaging. What was the other question there then?
Yeah, the other question was very similar to that, is about multi-generational trauma and how that impacts upon the relationships of young people with the adults who look after them. And is any thoughts from young people themselves and how to respond to that sort of scenario? I suppose your comments about community champions might go in some way towards answering that.
Yeah, and acknowledging, and I mean the point I made about Harris's, is it Bethan Harris's her research that often it's not always, but sometimes our own children, our black and mixed heritage children, boys, whatever, and you say racism's the thing, but it's quite clearly it is because of the exclusion on every level, structural, psychosocial, in towns, whatever. Um, so so um so what was I going to say? So I suppose it encouraging our own children in a positive sense to acknowledge that and to work from that then in a positive sense. I think, like I said, I mean, I don't think our own parents, our own grand, acknowledge the trauma of racism often. They might experience everyday racism, but not the trauma of it. But it's manifested. It's until we understand where we are. And obviously, lots of people do, but our children, until we understand where we are physically and psychologically, why as I often say, we're eating the crumbs off the cake off the table. Um, Both in an emotional, psychosocial sense, but in a physical sense, we ain't gonna make any change, are we? And obviously, we're applying this to the criminal justice system, but we know all the disproportionality. I'm going on.
No, it's all good content. Thank you very much, John. So just because of time, I'm going to wrap up there. Please feel free to keep in touch with CYCJ through emails or so, and I'm sure John would be delighted to hear from you if you have any direct questions. And thank you to everybody who's put some comments in the chat. One comment I would like to point out is highlight and encourage you to have a click onto is from Katia. CYCJ are currently undertaking a stakeholder survey to get your thoughts on what CYCJ should be doing in the future, and also thoughts on our existing website. Any comments on that would be much appreciated to help us create something even shinier and nicer and more effective. So thanks everybody for coming along. I hope to see you at next webinar, and more importantly, thank you, John, for giving up your time today for a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks all for listening to my thoughts. Oh, okay, ta-ra.